Once upon a time in a kingdom called Eldoria, there lived a young prince named Dante. His home wasn't just any kingdom, it was a place where the castle towers were made of ivory so white they seemed to glow in the sunlight. The fields were always green, the rivers ran clear, and the people were always smiling. Dante loved his home. He spent his days exploring the castle's secret passages, racing his horse across the meadows, and learning the history of his people from wise old tutors. His life was simple, happy, and filled with the promise of a bright future. He was the sun-kissed prince, and the world was his playground. Dante's parents, King Theron and Queen Alara, were kind and just rulers. They taught him that being a prince wasn't about wearing a crown or giving orders. It was about responsibility. It was about caring for every single person in the kingdom as if they were family. Dante took their lessons to heart. He would often sneak out of the castle, dressed in simple clothes, to walk among the villagers in the market. He listened to their stories, shared their bread, and learned their names. He didn't see them as subjects. He saw them as friends. This connection to his people was the most precious treasure he possessed, more valuable than all the gold in the royal vaults. His days were a symphony of peaceful moments. He'd wake to the sound of birds singing outside his window and the smell of fresh pastries from the castle kitchens. After his lessons, he would practice swordsmanship with the captain of the royal guard, not for war, but as a dance of discipline and focus. His laughter echoed through the grand halls, a constant reminder of the joy that filled the Ivory Kingdom. He believed this peace would last forever. He couldn't imagine a world where the sun didn't shine on Eldoria, or where the smiles of his people would ever fade. The thought of darkness was just a story, something you'd find in dusty old books, not in his real life. But even in the brightest of kingdoms, shadows can gather unseen. Dante was young and knew little of the world beyond Eldoria's protected borders. He heard whispers of restless warlords in the distant lands, but they felt as unreal as dragons and goblins. To him, the world was Eldoria, and Eldoria was perfect. He dreamed of the day he would become king and continue his parents' legacy of peace and prosperity. He was a boy on the cusp of manhood, with a heart full of hope and a future that seemed as solid and shining as the ivory towers of his home. He had no idea how quickly a perfect world could be shattered into a million pieces. The day the world ended began like any other. The sun rose, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but then, a different color appeared on the horizon. It was a dark, ugly smudge of black smoke. An alarm bell began to clang, a frantic, desperate sound that Dante had never heard before. It wasn't the cheerful bell that called people to festivals. This was a sound of pure terror. Soldiers shouted, people screamed, and the smell of fire began to choke the clean morning air. A brutal warlord named Cain, a man whose heart was as black as the armor he wore, had brought his army to the gates of the Ivory Kingdom. They were a storm of steel and fury, and they had come to destroy everything. Dante was rushed into the throne room by the royal guard. His parents stood there, not with fear in their eyes, but with a grim determination. King Theron wore his battle armor, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Queen Alara held her head high, her usual gentle face now a mask of fierce resolve. They looked at Dante, and in that moment, he saw the true weight of the crown. They weren't just his parents, they were the shield of their people. They told him he had to run, he had to survive. As long as he lived, Eldoria lived. He protested, wanting to stay and fight, but his father's command was absolute. A king's first duty is to his people's future, and you, my son, are that future, he said, his voice heavy with a love that broke Dante's heart. The castle shook as Cain's war machine smashed against the ivory walls. The beautiful towers began to crumble. Through a high window, Dante saw the horror unfold. Cain's soldiers were merciless, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. The green fields were being trampled under the boots of the invading army, and the clear rivers were beginning to run red. It was a nightmare brought to life. A loyal guard grabbed Dante's arm and pulled him toward a secret passage hidden behind a tapestry. The last thing Dante ever saw of his parents was them turning to face the throne room doors as they burst open, ready to make their final stand for the kingdom they loved. Dante ran. He stumbled through the dark, narrow passage, the sounds of battle fading behind him, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breaths and the thunder of his own heart. Every step took him further from his home, from his life, from everything he had ever known. When he finally emerged from the tunnel, far beyond the castle walls, he looked back. The Ivory Kingdom was engulfed in flames. The proud white towers were now blackened, broken teeth against a smoke-filled sky. He was alone. The sun-kissed prince was gone, burned away in the fire. In his place was just a boy, lost and broken, with nothing left but the ghosts of a memory and the cold, bitter taste of ash. Days turned into weeks. Dante, the boy who was once a prince, was now just another orphan in a world that had suddenly grown cruel and unforgiving. He traded his fine royal clothes for dirty rags to hide his identity. He learned to sleep in dark alleys and abandoned barns, always with one eye open. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. He learned the hard way that a friendly face could hide a thief's intent, and that a helping hand was a rare thing indeed. The world outside the castle walls was not the friendly place he had known. It was a place of survival, where the weak were preyed upon by the strong, and kindness was a currency few could afford to spend. He traveled from town to town, a ghost haunted by the fire that had consumed his past. He took on odd jobs, washing dishes or mucking out stables for a piece of bread, never staying in one place for too long. He was terrified that someone might recognize him, that Cain's spies were everywhere. The memory of his parents' sacrifice was a heavy weight on his young shoulders. He had to survive, just as they had commanded. But what was the point of surviving in a world without hope? Despair was a cold fog that threatened to swallow him whole, and some days, it was hard to find a reason to keep going. He was no longer Dante, the prince. He was just a nobody, a speck of dust in the wind. One rainy evening, huddled in the doorway of a rowdy tavern, Dante watched a group of thugs trying to rob an old merchant. He wanted to look away, to mind his own business as he had learned to do. But something inside him, the last ember of the prince he once was, refused to let the injustice happen. Before he could stop himself, he shouted. It was a foolish, reckless act. The thugs immediately turned on him, their sneers promising a world of pain. Dante braced himself for the worst, knowing he was no match for them. This was it. This was how his sad, lonely story would end. Suddenly a figure stepped out from the tavern's shadows. He was a tall man with a weathered face, scars that told 100 stories, and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. With a speed that seemed impossible, he disarmed the thugs, moving with a fluid, deadly grace. He didn't kill them, he just dismantled them, leaving them groaning on the muddy ground. The man looked at Dante, his expression unreadable. "You've got a lot of spirit, kid, but not a lot of sense," he grumbled. The name's Hawk. This gruff, mysterious man had just saved his life. For the first time since the fall of Eldoria, Dante felt a tiny, fragile flicker of something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. Hawk took me under his wing, though not out of pity. He saw something in my eyes, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by all the suffering I'd endured. Hawk was a mercenary, a man who lived by his wits and his blades and, well, he decided to teach me his trade. The lessons were brutal. There were no gentle tutors, no padded practice swords. My classroom was the forest, the swamp, and the grimy backstreets of forgotten towns. I learned how to move without making a sound, how to blend into the darkness until I was nothing more than a whisper of movement. I learned to read the land, to track animals, and to know which plants could heal and which could kill. Hawk's training was relentless. "The world doesn't care if you're tired, kid," he'd say, always pushing me to run farther, fight harder. It only cares if you're alive at the end of the day. I learned to fight with daggers, not the elegant sword of a prince. My fighting style became practical, efficient, and lethal. It was the style of a survivor, not a nobleman. Every muscle in my body ached and every day brought new bruises and cuts. But with the pain came strength. The soft prince was being stripped away layer by layer and a new person was being forged in his place. I was becoming sharper, harder, and more aware of the world around me. Through it all, a strange bond formed between Hawk and me. Hawk was not a father figure in the way King Theron had been. He was gruff, impatient, and rarely offered a kind word. Yet in his own way, he cared. He made sure I ate, even if it was just stale bread. He patched up my wounds after a particularly harsh training session. He taught me not just how to fight, but how to think like a survivor. He taught me to trust my instincts, to see the world for what it was, not what I wished it to be. I began to see the man behind the hardened exterior, a man who also knew loss, and who had built walls around his heart to protect it. One evening, sitting by a crackling fire, Hawk spoke of his own past. He told a story of betrayal, of a comrade who had left him for dead for a bag of gold. "In our world, kid, trust is the most expensive thing you can own. Don't give it away cheaply." That lesson, honestly, sank deep into my soul. I was learning that strength wasn't just about how hard you could hit, it was about resilience, about knowing who to trust, and about having a purpose. My purpose was becoming clearer every day. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was vengeance. I would use everything Hawk taught me to one day face the man who had destroyed my world. Cain. Years passed. I grew from a boy into a young man, my body lean and strong, my eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had, well, seen too much. Hawk and I worked together, taking on jobs as mercenaries, and our reputation grew. We were a formidable team. But Cain's shadow was long, and his power had only spread since the fall of Eldoria. One day, a job went horribly wrong. It was a trap, laid by Cain himself, who had heard rumors of a skilled young fighter traveling with the legendary Hawk. Cain's soldiers surrounded us. Hawk fought like a cornered lion, protecting me, giving me a chance to escape. I watched in horror as Hawk, my mentor, my only friend, fell to Cain's blade. The warlord stood over Hawk's body, a cruel smirk on his face, and then turned his cold eyes toward me. "You have his spirit," Cain sneered. "I'll enjoy crushing it." Overwhelmed by grief and rage, I fought with a fury I didn't know I possessed, but I was outnumbered and outmatched. I was struck down, a searing pain exploding in my side, and the world went black. I had failed Hawk, I had failed my parents, I had failed Eldoria. Darkness was finally coming to claim me. But it was not the end. I awoke not in the afterlife but on a bed of soft moss in a place that felt ancient and peaceful. Sunlight filtered through a thick canopy of leaves, dappling the ground in gentle patterns. An old man with a long white beard and robes the color of the evening sky sat nearby, tending to my wound. The air hummed with a quiet energy, a magic that felt comforting and alive. My wound, which should have been fatal, was already healing, a faint green light glowing around it. "Rest, child," the old man said, his voice calm and soothing. "You are safe here. My name is Elric." Elric was a mage, a hermit who lived in this hidden magical glade far from the troubles of the world. He explained that he had felt a great disturbance, a cry of pain and despair, and had found me at the edge of death. As he healed my body, he also sensed the power lying dormant within me, a deep connection to the shadows, born of my immense loss and sorrow. "Your grief has hollowed you out," Elric explained gently. "But a hollow space can be filled. The shadows you fear can become your greatest strength. They are not evil, merely misunderstood. They answer to pain, and you, young one, have known more pain than most." Under Elric's guidance, I began a new kind of training. This wasn't about swords or daggers, it was about the mind and the spirit. Elric taught me to reach into the darkness inside myself, the abyss of my grief, and not be consumed by it. He taught me to control it, to shape it, to command it. I learned to melt into the shadows, becoming truly invisible. I could move from one patch of darkness to another in the blink of an eye, a skill called shadow stepping. The darkness was no longer a place to hide, it was my ally, my cloak, and my weapon. It responded to my will, an extension of my own determined spirit. As my power grew, so did my resolve. The fire of vengeance still burned within me, but Elric's wisdom tempered it with purpose. It was no longer just about killing Cain, it was about restoring what had been lost. It was about bringing hope back to the people of Eldoria. I couldn't do that as Dante, the lost prince. That boy was gone, dead with his mentor in the dust. I needed a new identity, a symbol that would strike fear into the hearts of my enemies and inspire hope in the oppressed. I would be the shadow that fights back. I would be the whisper of justice in the night. I chose the name Grim. Elric gave me a final gift, a suit of armor forged from cooled shadows and enchanted steel, dark as a moonless night, and 2 daggers that seemed to drink the light around them. When I put on the armor, I was transformed. I was no longer the sun-kissed prince or the grieving apprentice. I was Grim, a master of shadows, my face hidden by a deep cowl that revealed only the glint of my determined eyes. I was a living embodiment of the night, a phantom ready to reclaim my destiny. I thanked the old mage, the man who had healed my body and my soul, and left the sanctuary of the glade. Grim returned to the world, but the world did not recognize me. I moved through the lands now ruled by Cain, a silent observer. I saw the misery of my people, living under the warlord's iron fist. The once bright towns were now gray and grim, the people's faces etched with fear and hunger. This sight hardened my resolve into unbreakable steel. I began my campaign not with a direct assault, but from the darkness. I dismantled Kane's supply lines, freed political prisoners, and struck down corrupt captains, leaving behind only a whispered name: Grim. A legend began to grow among the people, a story of a shadowy avenger who fought for them. The legend of Grim spread like wildfire, fanning the embers of rebellion in the hearts of the Eldorian people. Hope, a thing that had been crushed under Kane's boot, began to bloom again. Kane grew furious, his power base crumbling from the shadows. He could not fight an enemy he could not see. Finally, in a desperate rage, Kane issued a challenge. He called out the phantom named Grim, promising to execute 100 innocent villagers if his foe did not face him in the throne room of the Ivory Castle, the very room where my parents had made their last stand. I knew it was a trap, but it was a challenge I had to accept. The time for hiding was over. I walked through the gates of my old home. The ivory was stained and broken, a sad monument to a forgotten time. I strode into the throne room, a lone dark figure against the backdrop of ruin. Kane was waiting for me, seated on the stolen throne, surrounded by his most elite guards. "So, the ghost decides to show himself," Kane sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Your little games end today." The battle that followed was epic. I moved like a blur, a dance of shadows and steel. I used the darkness of the hall to my advantage, disappearing and reappearing, my daggers finding their mark with deadly precision. The guards fell one by one, unable to fight the living knight. Finally, it was just me and Kane. We circled each other, the master of shadows against the brutal warlord. Our blades clashed, sparks flying in the dim light. Kane was strong, a whirlwind of brute force, but I was faster, smarter. I used his rage against him, dodging his clumsy, powerful swings and landing precise, calculated strikes. The fight raged through the throne room, a battle for the soul of a kingdom. In the end, I saw an opening. Using my shadow step ability, I appeared behind Kane, disarming him in a single fluid motion. The warlord stood defeated, his sword clattering on the stone floor. He was powerless before the shadow he had created. With Kane defeated, I stood before the people who had gathered outside the castle, drawn by the sounds of battle. I pulled back my cowl, revealing the face of their long-lost Prince Dante. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by cheers of joy and relief. I was not just an avenger, I was their rightful king returned. I did not execute Kane but had him imprisoned, for justice, not vengeance, would be the foundation of the new Eldoria. Embracing my role as King Grim, I promised my people that the sun would shine on our kingdom once more. I had walked through the darkest of nights, but I had brought the dawn with me, ready to rebuild my home and lead my people into a new era of hope.